This is going to talk a little bit about blood types, and we're going to do a couple Punnett squares using blood types. So the human ABO blood system is an example of codominance because more than one allele is dominant, and it's also an example of a multiple allele trait because there's more than two alleles that control this trait. There are three alleles in this system. We're going to indicate them as the two dominant alleles are an uppercase I with a superscript A and superscript B, and then the lowercase I is the recessive allele. Now, this is an example of codominance because if you have a combination where you have both of these dominant alleles together, they both fully express. So you have both of the characteristics from both of those dominant alleles. Now, that's a little bit different from a situation where there's incomplete dominance. In incomplete dominant situation, the phenotype is somewhere in between the two dominant alleles. And so an example of that is if you crossed a red snapdragon flower with a white snapdragon flower, because of the incomplete dominance, the offspring would have a pink flower, so it'd be kind of in between the red and the white. But this is an example of codominance because they are both fully expressed in the phenotype of the individual. So you still have two alleles. Each person still has two alleles. So the possible combinations then would be both dominant alleles with the superscript A, so both dominant A alleles. You could also have a dominant A and a recessive allele. You could have a dominant A and a dominant B. You could have two dominant Bs. You could have a dominant B and a recessive, and you could have two recessives. So there are a lot of different possible combinations for the two alleles that you would have with the human ABO blood system. Now, because of the way the dominance works, if you have the dominant allele and it's both A's, and that's type A blood. So the dominant still masks the expression of the recessive, so this would also be type A. If you have both alleles that are dominant, but they're the different dominant, they both express. So this is type AB. This one would be type B. This would also be type B. And then if you have both of the recessive ones, then you have type O blood. And remember, the typing in the human blood system has to do with what proteins your red blood cell produces. So with type A blood, they produce a certain protein, type A protein, that other people react to as kind of a foreign substance. So if you give type A blood to a type O individual, they will have an allergic reaction to that. If you have type B blood, you produce type B protein on your red blood cells. If you have type AB blood, then you make both the proteins. And if you have type O blood, you don't make either. Okay, so this is kind of how the system works. So now let's do a Punnett square crossing a person who has type AB blood with a person who has type O blood. So we know if they have type AB blood, the only way to get that combination is to have both of the dominant alleles, the two different dominant alleles. The only way to have type O blood is to have both of the recessive alleles. So if we set up our Punnett square, then we've got the two alleles from one parent on top, and then the two alleles from the other parent on the side. And when we bring those together, the possible combinations for the offspring would be this. So in this cross between a type AB parent and a type O parent, of the four possible offspring, one of them would have type A blood, another one here would have type A, and then the two over here would have type B. So 50% would have type A blood and 50% of the offspring would have type B blood. Let's look at one more cross. We're going to cross a type A blood, and we're going to say this is the homozygous type A blood with a type B blood that is heterozygous. Okay, so if it's the homozygous type A blood, then that means we're talking about this genetic makeup, this genotype. So it's the two dominant A's. If it's heterozygous type B blood, then we're talking about this genotype. So a dominant type B and then a recessive I. All right, so here's the Punnett square. We've got one parent on the top, the homozygous dominant type A parent on the top, and the heterozygous type B parent on the side. So the allele combination, when these come together, would be this offspring would have type AB blood because they got one dominant from each of the parents. This offspring would have type A blood because they got a dominant A from one parent and then a recessive from the other parent. This offspring would have type AB blood because they got a dominant A from one parent and a dominant B from the other. And then the last offspring would have type A blood as well because they got a dominant A from one parent and then a recessive allele from the other parent. So looking at these four offspring, half of them, or 50%, would have type AB blood and 50% of them would have type A blood. So just because you have a different blood type from your parents does not mean that you're not related to them. It's very easy with this multiple allelic trait to have very different phenotypes in your offspring as compared to the genotypes and the phenotypes of the parents.